Before we delve into the shadows of Kansas City's past, a vital disclaimer. This narrative is a compilation of facts gathered from historical records, federal investigations, court documents, and biographies. The sole purpose is to present to you, the viewer, a complete and accurate account of a fascinating chapter in American history. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, determined footsteps of a young man learning the art of power. So, lean back, relax, and let us journey back to the genesis of an empire built not on rock, but on sand. Imagine, if you will, a city pulsing with the energy of industry and expansion at the dawn of the 20th century. Kansas City was a place of immense potential, a railroad hub where fortunes were made and lost, and where the lines between legitimate business and outright corruption were often blurred into invisibility. Into this fertile ground stepped a figure who would become the architect of its underworld, a man whose name would become synonymous with absolute control, Tom Pendergast. But to understand the king, one must first understand the kingdom he inherited and the mentor who shaped his destiny. That mentor was his own older brother, James Pendergast. James was a classic political boss of the old school, a saloon keeper in the gritty, working class district known as the West Bottoms. His establishment was more than just a place to drink. It was a social hub, a political headquarters, and a welfare office all rolled into one. James understood the fundamental currency of machine politics, gratitude. He provided for his constituents in their most desperate moments. A job for the unemployed, a basket of coal for a freezing family, a sympathetic ear and a few dollars for a widow, or intervention with a harsh police officer or a relentless landlord. In return, he asked not for money, but for something far more valuable, their unwavering loyalty, which translated directly into votes on election day. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of power. The more favors he gave, the more loyal voters he commanded. The more voters he commanded, the more influence he wielded at City Hall, and the more influence he wielded, the more favors he could dispense. Young Tom Pendergast, born in 1872, arrived in Kansas City and became his brother's apprentice. He was a keen observer, quieter and more calculating than the gregarious James. He did not just see the acts of charity, he saw the intricate machinery behind them. He learned how to assess a man's needs and leverage them, how to build a network of obligations so dense that escape was impossible. He saw that power was not about loud proclamations, but about silent, unshakable control. When James Pendergast, his health failing, began to pass the reins of his political organization to his younger brother, he gave Tom a piece of advice that would become the cornerstone of his empire. The key to politics, James said, is to get out and vote your friends and to protect them in their jobs and their homes. Tom took this simple, powerful idea and expanded it into a blueprint for total domination. He was not content with merely influencing one ward. He envisioned a city-wide network, a machine where every cog, from the highest police official to the lowest street sweeper, turned because he willed it. This was the foundation, a legacy of patronage and personal loyalty inherited from his brother. But Tom Pendergast was about to build a skyscraper on that foundation, a structure so tall and so dark it would eventually block out the very sun of democracy in Kansas City. The era of the mild-mannered benefactor was over. The era of the boss was about to begin. With the foundation laid by his brother, Tom Pendergast began a methodical and ruthless expansion of his power base. The transition from James's localized influence to Tom's city-wide dominance was not an overnight phenomenon. It was a masterclass in political strategy, executed with the patience of a spider weaving its web. Pendergast understood that to control the city, he needed to control its government. And to control its government, he needed to control the Democratic Party apparatus in Jackson County. This was his primary battlefield. He started by consolidating his hold in the First Ward, ensuring his operatives, his ward healers, knew every voter by name, knew their troubles, their debts, their aspirations. These operatives were the capillaries of his political body, delivering the lifeblood of favors and threats to every household. A job on the city's payroll, as a policeman, a fireman, a sanitation worker, was the most common currency. But Pendergast's genius was in diversifying his portfolio of influence. He invested heavily in legitimate and illegitimate businesses alike. He had interests in concrete companies, laundries, and the ready, mixed concrete company, which would later become a critical piece of his undoing. But more importantly, he formed a symbiotic alliance with the criminal underworld. Kansas City, under Pendergast's emerging machine, was being transformed into an open city, a term that meant it was neutral territory for organized crime syndicates from Chicago, New York, and elsewhere. They were free to operate gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, as long as they paid a tribute, a hefty tax, to the Pendergast machine. This flood of illicit cash provided him with a war chest that no conventional politician could match. It paid for the armies of campaign workers. It funded the election day floaters who would vote multiple times. And it lined the pockets of judges, prosecutors, and police officials, ensuring they would look the other way. The police force, in particular, became not a law enforcement agency, but a protection service for Pendergast's interests. Raids on gambling dens or speakeasies would only happen on those establishments that had failed to pay their dues. This created a perverse form of order. Crime was not eliminated, it was regulated, bureaucratized, and monetized by the machine. The year 1925 marked a pivotal moment in this ascent. Pendergast threw his support behind a seemingly unlikely candidate for county judge, a young, unassuming man named Harry S. Truman. Many of Pendergast's inner circle were skeptical of Truman, seeing him as too honest, too independent. But Pendergast, in a display of his sharp political instinct, saw something else. He saw a man of integrity who was also loyal and electable. With the full, formidable weight of the Pendergast machine behind him, Truman won his election. This alliance was mutually beneficial. Truman got a political career, and Pendergast got a reliable and honest administrator in a key position, which lent a veneer of respectability to his operations. It was a telling choice. Pendergast was so confident in his control that he could afford to place an honest man in office, knowing the system itself was too corrupt for one man to change. By the late 1920s, Tom Pendergast was no longer just a political boss. He was the de facto ruler of Kansas City. He held no major elected office, yet every significant appointment, every contract, every law that was passed or enforced bore the invisible stamp of his approval. He operated from a nondescript, two-story building at 1908 Main Street, which journalists of the era aptly nicknamed the Doghouse. It was from this unassuming headquarters that he wielded power more absolute than any mayor or governor, presiding over a kingdom of his own creation, a kingdom where the law was merely a suggestion and loyalty to the boss was the only true commandment. The zenith of Pendergast's power in the early 1930s transformed Kansas City into a living, breathing monument to his rule, a place where the surreal became mundane and the corrupt became standard operating procedure. To truly grasp the absolute nature of his control, one must picture the city not as a municipality governed by laws, but as a private corporation with Pendergast as its sole shareholder and CEO. His word was the final arbitration in everything from labor disputes to corporate mergers. If a business wanted to operate without harassment, it needed the boss's blessing, which, of course, came at a price. This was the era of the Pendergast percent, an unofficial but universally understood tax on nearly every major project in the city. His ready, mixed concrete company enjoyed a virtual monopoly. If you were pouring concrete in Kansas City, you were buying it from Tom Pendergast. This stranglehold on essential materials made him a millionaire many times over. His wealth extracted directly from the very infrastructure of the city he controlled. The political process became a hollow ritual, a theatrical performance staged by the machine for public consumption. Elections were not contests, they were coronations. The machine's methods for ensuring victory were brazen and systematic. Floaters were imported from other states, given a few dollars and a list of names and addresses, and would vote early and often, moving from precinct to precinct. Poll watchers from opposition parties were intimidated, assaulted, or simply barred from entering. Ballot boxes were stuffed in the back rooms of Pendergast, owned saloons long before the polls even opened. In the 1934 municipal election, the absurdity reached its peak. In some wards, the number of votes cast far exceeded the number of registered voters. One precinct reported a unanimous, statistically impossible vote for the machine's slate of candidates. The message was clear. The will of the people was irrelevant. The only will that mattered was that of the boss. Yet, paradoxically, this was also a period of immense physical transformation for Kansas City. The Great Depression was crippling the nation, but in Kansas City, federal money from the New Deal flowed like water, and Pendergast, with his ally Harry Truman, now a U.S. Senator, was the gatekeeper. He controlled the distribution of Works Progress Administration, WPA funds, which meant thousands of jobs and countless contracts were his to dispense. This further cemented his power, as unemployment in his domain was low not because of a healthy economy, but because he was the economy. New roads, parks, and public buildings rose from the ground, many built with Pendergast concrete and manned by Pendergast loyalists. The cityscape modernized, but its soul was mortgaged to corruption. The nightlife, funded by illicit cash and protected by a complicit police force, was legendary. Jazz clubs thrived, with legends like Count Basie and Charlie Parker finding their voice in a city where vice was not a crime, but an industry. For the average citizen, life under the machine was a strange mix of comfort and coercion. If you kept your head down, didn't challenge the system, and were a loyal voter, you could live in a city with jobs and entertainment. But the price was the complete surrender of your democratic voice. The police were not your protectors. They were the enforcers for a regime where justice was a commodity for sale. The courthouse was not a hall of justice. It was a marketplace where verdicts were negotiated. Tom Pendergast, sitting in his Doghouse, had achieved a level of control that was the envy of gangsters and the despair of reformers. He had built an empire that seemed utterly unassailable, a fortress of patronage, fear, and money. But it was at this very moment of peak power, when he seemed to stand as an untouchable king, that the first, almost imperceptible, cracks began to appear in the foundations of his kingdom. The very forces he had unleashed, unchecked greed and absolute power, were already conspiring to bring the walls tumbling down. The downfall of Tom Pendergast, like his rise, was not a sudden explosion but a slow, relentless unraveling, a cascade of events triggered by his own hubris and the changing tides of federal power. The first major tremor came from an unexpected source, a rebellion within his own domain. While Pendergast had long controlled Kansas City, the state of Missouri was a different battleground. In 1936, he decided to flex his muscle on a statewide level, throwing the full weight of his machine behind the re-election of Governor Lloyd C. Stark. Stark, a wealthy nurseryman, seemed like a pliable candidate, and Pendergast assumed he would be another puppet on the state stage. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Once in office, Governor Stark, a man with his own political ambitions and a deep-seated resentment of the boss's control, turned on his benefactor with a vengeance. He was not a local reformer who could be easily intimidated. He was the governor, with the resources and authority of the state at his disposal. Stark understood that to break Pendergast's power, he needed to attack the pillars that held it up, the police force and the electoral process. He began by wresting control of the Kansas City Police Department from the city government, placing it under a state-appointed board that was loyal to him, not to Pendergast. This single move was a devastating blow. For the first time in over a decade, the police were no longer an arm of the machine. They began to raid the gambling joints and brothels that operated with impunity, disrupting the massive cash flow that funded Pendergast's political operations. Open City was suddenly being closed brick by brick, simultaneously. Stark launched a sweeping investigation into the machine's rampant voter fraud, empowering a young, ambitious federal attorney named Maurice Milligan, with a state government now actively hostile to him. Pendergast's fortress was no longer impregnable. The second, and ultimately fatal, blow came from the federal level. The Internal Revenue Service had been quietly building a case against Pendergast for years. His lavish lifestyle, the palatial home, the racehorses, the vast sums of money flowing through his accounts was impossible to hide and difficult to explain with his modest official income. The IRS investigation, led by Special Agent Rudolph Hartman, began to trace the money. They uncovered a web of secret bank accounts, clandestine cash transfers, and a system of kickbacks so brazen that it stunned even seasoned investigators. The focus zeroed in on the massive insurance kickback scheme involving several large American insurance companies. To secure lucrative contracts with the state of Missouri, these companies had been funneling enormous bribes, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune in the Depression era, directly to Pendergast. The money was often delivered in cash-filled suitcases. Pendergast, perhaps believing himself truly untouchable, had failed to report a single cent of this income on his tax returns. This was no longer a matter of political corruption, which was difficult to prosecute. This was the clear, unambiguous federal crime of income tax evasion. The noose was tightening. The man who had controlled judges and prosecutors for 2 decades now found himself in the crosshairs of a federal justice system that was beyond his reach. His old ally, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had tolerated Pendergast for his ability to deliver Missouri's votes, now saw him as a political liability and gave the green light for the prosecution to proceed. The king of Kansas City was about to discover that there was one power greater than his own, the United States government. The year 1939 marked the final, dramatic act in the tragedy of Tom Pendergast, a public spectacle that captivated and shocked the nation. The once untouchable boss was now a defendant. Sitting in a federal courtroom, his fate in the hands of a system he had spent a lifetime manipulating. The trial was a national sensation, splashed across the front pages of newspapers from coast to coast. It was portrayed as the ultimate showdown between law and order and a corrupt political machine. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Maurice Milligan, presented a methodical, paper-based case that was as dry as it was damning. They didn't need dramatic eyewitness accounts of gangland shootings. They had bank ledgers, canceled checks, and tax returns. They meticulously laid out a trail of financial transactions that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Thomas J. Pendergast had received $115,000 in bribes from the insurance pool and another $440,000 from other shady sources, and had willfully evaded paying $431,000 in taxes on that income. The defense, in a move that signaled their desperation, argued that Pendergast was a simple man, confused by his finances, and that the money was merely loans from friends. This argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The sheer scale of the hidden wealth, the secretive nature of the transactions, and the testimony from insurance executives who detailed the payoffs painted a picture of deliberate and systematic fraud. Pendergast, who had always been a figure of whispered legend, was now being reduced to a series of cold, hard numbers in a ledger book. The most poignant and symbolic moment of the trial came when the prosecution entered into evidence Pendergast's personal financial records, which he had been forced to surrender. These documents laid bare the entire financial engine of his empire. There was no grand ideology, no political philosophy, just the brutal arithmetic of power, money in, favors out. On May 27, 1939, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. The sound of the gavel hitting the bench was the sound of an era ending. Pendergast remained stoic, but the world he had built was collapsing around him in real time. A few weeks later, he stood before Judge Merrill E. Otis for sentencing. The judge, condemning Pendergast's crimes as a shocking betrayal of public trust that had poisoned the very well of democracy, handed down the maximum sentence allowed by law of 15 months in a federal penitentiary and a 10,000 fine. But the true punishment was far greater than the prison term. He was publicly disgraced, a broken king. The Missouri Bar Association immediately disbarred him, stripping him of his professional standing. The political machine, that intricate and powerful organism, began to disintegrate the moment its head was severed. Without Pendergast's central command and his flow of illicit cash, the network of ward healers, corrupt officials, and loyalists scattered. The Pendergast machine, which had seemed like a permanent feature of the American political landscape, vanished almost overnight. In April 1939, even before his sentencing, he was admitted to the Mayo Clinic for a heart condition, but his real ailment was a broken empire. The man who had controlled the fate of millions was now just prisoner number 26768, first at the Federal Correctional Institution in Leavenworth, Kansas, and later transferred to the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield. The fortress had fallen. The final years of Tom Pendergast's life, from his release from prison to his death in 1945, were a study in quiet obscurity, a stark and humiliating contrast to the roaring decades of his absolute power. When he was released from the federal prison in Springfield in early 1941, after serving just over a year of his sentence, he returned to a Kansas City that was no longer his. The city had moved on. The machine was a ghost, its remnants scattered and purged. The police force, now under state control, was being reformed. The gambling dens and brothels that had funded his empire had been raided and shuttered. The flow of illicit cash had dried up completely. He returned to his mansion on Ward Parkway, but he was a pariah, a living cautionary tale. The powerful men who once crowded his waiting room at the Doghouse now crossed the street to avoid him. His phone, which had once been a direct line to governors and senators, now rang rarely, if at all. His health, always precarious, deteriorated further. The heart condition that had secured his early release now consumed him, a physical manifestation of a broken spirit. He was a spectral presence in the city he had built and broken, a man trapped in the gilded cage of his past. He spent his days in relative isolation, his influence reduced to a memory and his power to a subject for historians. The world, meanwhile, was transforming at a dizzying pace. America entered World War II, and Kansas City, like the rest of the nation, turned its attention to the war effort. The monumental struggles on global battlefields made the local political squabbles of the 1930s seem small and sordid. The era of the grandiose political boss was passing, replaced by a more bureaucratic, media-conscious form of politics. Pendergast became an anachronism in his own lifetime. There is a profound irony in the fact that his most famous protégé, Harry S. Truman, was ascending to the very heights of American power at the very moment Pendergast was sinking into the shadows. In 1944, as Franklin D. Roosevelt selected Truman as his vice presidential running mate, Republicans and anti-machine Democrats tried to smear Truman with the Pendergast brush. But Truman, with his reputation for personal honesty and his record as an effective senator, managed to survive the association. He never publicly denounced Pendergast, a testament to his famous loyalty, but he also never lifted a finger to help him after his fall. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Harry S. Truman, the man whose political career was launched from the Doghouse on Main Street, became the President of the United States. One can only imagine the complex and bitter thoughts that must have raced through the mind of the dying boss, watching from his sickbed as his one time ally assumed the most powerful office in the world, while he himself was a disgraced and forgotten felon. The wheel of fortune had turned completely on January 26, 1945, just a few months before Truman would ascend to the presidency. Thomas Joseph Pendergast died at his home. The official cause was a coronary occlusion, but it was truly a death from a broken heart and a shattered empire. His funeral was a muted affair, a far cry from the spectacle that would have accompanied the passing of the king a decade earlier. Some old loyalists attended, but the city's current power brokers were conspicuously absent. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery, his legacy a permanent stain on the history of Kansas City, a complex story of power, corruption, and the inescapable consequences of absolute hubris. The story of Tom Pendergast does not end with his burial in Calvary Cemetery. Rather, his legacy casts a long and complex shadow that forces us to confront difficult questions about power, corruption, and the very nature of American democracy. What is the true cost of such a regime, not in dollars and cents, but in the soul of a city? For nearly 2 decades, Kansas City thrived and suffered under a bizarre duality. On one hand, there was a perverse kind of efficiency. Streets were paved, jobs were provided during the depths of the Depression, and a vibrant, if illicit, cultural scene flourished. Pendergast's machine provided a brutal, authoritarian form of stability. But this stability was a Faustian bargain, paid for with the currency of civic virtue. The most profound and lasting damage was the normalization of corruption. An entire generation of Kansasicians grew up in a world where the law was a joke, where success depended not on merit, but on connections, and where the democratic process was a hollow farce. This eroded public trust in government to a degree that would take generations to rebuild. It created a cynicism that seeped into the bedrock of the community, a lingering suspicion that those in power are always playing a crooked game. The machine's alliance with organized crime also left a permanent scar. embedding criminal elements deep within the city's economic and social fabric, a problem that would outlive Pendergast by many years. Furthermore, the machine's power was built on a foundation of intimidation and fear. While the boss himself rarely issued direct threats, his system enabled brutality. Opposition was not just defeated at the polls, it was physically crushed. Union organizers, reformist journalists, and political opponents faced harassment, beatings, and worse. The infamous Union Station Massacre of 1933, while not directly ordered by Pendergast, was a symptom of the environment he created. A world where criminals operated with such impunity that they could attempt a brazen daylight rescue of a captured gang member, leading to a bloody shootout that left 4 law enforcement officers and their prisoner dead. This was the logical endpoint of the open city policy. Yet, the Pendergast story is also a testament to the resilience of democratic institutions. His downfall was ultimately engineered not by a rival gangster, but by the instruments of the very government he sought to control: a state governor, a federal judge, and an agency of the federal government, the IRS. It proved that no one is truly above the law, no matter how powerful they seem. The system, though slow and flawed, eventually self-corrected. The saga also offers a crucial lesson about the nature of power itself. Pendergast's empire was not toppled by external enemies. While it was strong, it collapsed from within, rotted by its own excess. His insatiable greed, which initially fueled his rise, became the instrument of his destruction. The insurance bribe that sent him to prison was not a necessary move to maintain power. It was an act of sheer avarice from a man who believed he was beyond consequence. His story is a classic Greek tragedy played out on an American stage, a reminder that hubris is often the prelude to a great fall. And what of his relationship with Harry Truman? This remains one of the most debated aspects of his legacy. Truman's enemies never let him forget his association with the boss, yet Truman himself never denied it. He maintained a stubborn loyalty, a personal code that separated the man from the machine. In a strange way, Truman's subsequent career as a president known for his integrity may have been the ultimate repudiation of Pendergastism. It demonstrated that an honest man could emerge from a corrupt system, not by embracing its values, but by holding fast to his own. The ghost of Tom Pendergast haunted American politics for years, a specter invoked whenever the topic of machine politics arose. His life stands as an eternal warning of what happens when the lines between government and criminal enterprise are erased, when the pursuit of power becomes an end in itself, and when the votes of the people are treated as a commodity to be bought and sold. To truly grasp the immense power Tom Pendergast wielded, one must look beyond the political machinations and delve into the very real, tangible impact his rule had on the daily lives of every single Kansas citizen. This was not an abstract political science concept. It was a visceral reality that touched everything from the morning newspaper to the evening's entertainment. The machine's tentacles reached into every corner of commerce and society. If you were a small business owner, you understood that your ability to operate smoothly depended on your relationship with the machine. You needed a license or a permit that required a fee. To the right official, a man who answered to Pendergast, you were a construction contractor. You knew that your bid would only be successful if you used materials from Pendergast-owned companies, most notably his Ready Mixed Concrete Company. This was not a suggestion, it was an unbreakable rule. The concrete itself, the very substance upon which the modern city was being built, was a physical manifestation of his power. Every sidewalk, every foundation, every new public building was a monument to his monopoly, a constant, gray reminder of who was really in charge. The labor unions were similarly co-opted. Pendergast positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter in labor disputes. He could guarantee a peaceful workforce for business owners who played ball, and he could secure jobs and benefits for union members who pledged their political loyalty. This control over both capital and labor made him the indispensable middleman for the city's entire economy. But it was in the realm of vice that the machine's influence was most brazenly visible. Kansas City's nightlife was legendary, a neon-soaked oasis of sin in the heart of the conservative Midwest. This was by design. Pendergast had declared the city open, meaning that organized crime syndicates from across the country were welcome to operate their gambling parlors, brothels, and speakeasies as long as they paid a hefty tribute to the machine. The city was wide open, from the plush, carpeted gambling clubs downtown to the raucous jazz joints in the American district of 18th and Vine. The music of Count Basie and Charlie Parker provided the soundtrack to an era of unparalleled hedonism. But that artistic flourishing was underwritten by dirty money. The police were not a threat to these establishments. They were their protectors. A patrolman on the beat knew his job was not to shut down the illegal activity, but to ensure that the owners were in good standing with the machine. Raids only occurred as a form of collection, a warning to those who fell behind on their payments. This system created a bizarre form of order. Crime rates for petty theft and burglary were sometimes low because the professional criminals were all busy running the sanctioned vice operations. The violence that did occur was often between rival factions, jockeying for position within the machine's approved framework, or it was directed against those who threatened the system itself. For the average citizen, this created a world of strange contradictions. You could walk into a polling station and see your democratic right being openly mocked. Yet you could also feel a sense of security knowing that the boss's unofficial welfare system might provide a job or a food basket if you fell on hard times. You could despair at the corruption, yet enjoy the vibrant 24-hour energy of your city. This was the genius and the horror of Pendergast's rule. He made corruption functional. He made it seem, for a time, like a viable alternative to a chaotic and ineffective democracy. He provided a brutal, transactional form of governance that, for many, was preferable to the neglect and hardship of the Great Depression. He didn't just control the government, he became the environment, the very air people breathed, the skyline that rose in the 1920s and 30s, the jobs that put food on the table, the music that filled the night, all of it was filtered through the Pendergast machine. This total saturation of everyday life is what made his power so absolute and his eventual fall so disorienting for a city that had forgotten what it was like to function without its unseen, all-powerful landlord. The psychological portrait of Tom Pendergast is as complex and contradictory as the empire he built, a man whose personal characteristics defy the simplistic image of a snarling gangster. To understand how he held power for so long, one must look beyond the brute force of his machine and into the mind of the man himself. Publicly, Pendergast cultivated an image of a stern, respectable, and almost austere business leader. He was a family man, a devout Catholic who attended Mass regularly, and a philanthropist who made significant donations to churches, hospitals, and charities. This veneer of respectability was his first and most effective line of defense. It allowed the city's elite, the bankers, the newspaper publishers, the society figures, to do business with him, to tell themselves they were dealing with a tough but legitimate political leader, not a criminal kingpin. He was quiet, reserved, and preferred to listen rather than speak. In his headquarters at 1908 Main Street, the infamous Doghouse, he would sit for hours, receiving a constant stream of supplicants. A mayor needing advice, a policeman seeking a promotion, a widow facing eviction, a gangster seeking permission to operate, all passed through his doors. He heard their pleas, rarely showing emotion, and then issued his decisions with a finality that brooked no argument. This quiet authority was far more terrifying than any outburst of temper. It created an aura of omniscience, as if he were a godfather whose judgment was absolute and whose reach was infinite. He understood the power of perception. He never boasted. He never gave interviews glorifying his power. And he was almost never photographed in the company of the notorious gangsters who paid him tribute. This discipline was key to his longevity. While other crime bosses like Al Capone became infamous celebrities, Pendergast remained in the shadows, a name everyone knew, but a face few truly recognized. Yet, beneath this calm exterior was a will of iron and a capacity for ruthless calculation. He remembered every slight, every broken promise, and every act of disloyalty. Retribution was not always immediate or violent, but it was always certain. A businessman who crossed him would suddenly find his supply chains disrupted, his permits revoked, and his bank loans called in. A politician who betrayed him would find their career ended, their supporters peeled away, and their name dragged through the mud. This was not the hot, headed rage of a thug. It was the cold, systematic application of pressure, the political equivalent of a boa constrictor slowly squeezing the life from its prey. His other great weakness, which would ultimately prove fatal, was his passion for gambling, particularly on horse racing. This was more than a hobby. It was an all-consuming addiction. He maintained a stable of racehorses and would wager astronomical sums, sometimes losing tens of thousands of dollars in a single afternoon. This compulsive need for vast, liquid cash is what drove him to become increasingly brazen in his corruption. The insurance kickback scheme that brought him down was not just greed. It was a necessity to feed the bottomless pit of his gambling habit. This is the central tragedy and contradiction of Tom Pendergast. The man who displayed superhuman discipline in building and maintaining his political machine was utterly enslaved by a personal vice. The same mind that could outmaneuver governors and senators could not conquer its own addiction. This duality makes him a profoundly human, if not sympathetic, figure. He was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a flawed, complicated man whose greatest strengths were also the source of his ultimate weakness. He built a system of absolute control, yet he himself was out of control. He demanded unwavering loyalty from thousands, yet he was disloyal to the public trust he had utterly betrayed. He was a man who understood power intimately, but failed to understand the limits of his own. A miscalculation that would transform him from the most powerful man in Missouri into a forgotten inmate in a federal prison cell. The machinery of the Pendergast operation was a masterpiece of political engineering, a complex and self-sustaining system that functioned with the cold precision of a clock. To believe it was run solely through intimidation is to misunderstand its terrifying efficiency. The machine was a dual entity, presenting a benevolent face to the public, while its darker underbelly enforced its will. This public face was the system of patronage, a vast and intricate network of social welfare that was decades ahead of the federal government's New Deal. At the street level were the ward healers, the foot soldiers of the machine. These men were not thugs. They were neighborhood fixers. They knew every family in their precinct, their struggles, their needs. If a tenement dweller had their heat cut off in the dead of winter, the ward healer would arrive with a basket of coal. If a man lost his job, the ward healer could get him a position on the city's payroll, sweeping streets or digging ditches. If a family couldn't afford a doctor, the ward healer would appear with one, the bill mysteriously paid. At Christmas, thousands of food baskets were distributed to the poor. This was not pure charity. It was a calculated investment. The currency of repayment was not money, but votes and loyalty. The recipient was expected to vote the machine ticket and to ensure their family and friends did the same. This created a powerful personal bond that transcended ideology. People were loyal to Pendergast not out of fear, but out of gratitude. He was the man who put food on their table and a roof over their head when no one else would. This grassroots network was supervised by a layer of precinct captains and district leaders who reported up a clear chain of command to the boss himself in the doghouse. This system was funded by the machine's second, shadow economy, the alliance with organized crime. The revenue stream was staggering and continuous. Every brothel, every gambling den, every speakeasy, every slot machine paid a regular fee for the privilege of operating without police interference. This was not a random shakedown. It was a bureaucratized protection racket. The rates were standardized, and the collections were systematic, run with the efficiency of a tax collection agency. This immense river of cash flowed upward, funding the patronage that bought the votes, that maintained the power, that protected the criminal enterprises. It was a perfect, closed loop. The machine also controlled the unions, particularly those in the construction industry, by ensuring labor peace for friendly contractors and delivering jobs for union members. Pendergast secured another massive block of loyal voters and another source of political contributions. On election day, this entire apparatus swung into action with military-like coordination. The floaters, men paid to vote multiple times, were organized, transported, and given pre-marked ballots. Polling places were staffed by machine loyalists who would challenge opposition voters, stuff ballot boxes, or simply report fraudulent totals. The count was not an accounting of votes cast. It was the announcement of a result predetermined by the machine. The system was so effective that it could produce a voter turnout of over 100% in key precincts, a statistical impossibility that demonstrated not just corruption, but a blatant contempt for the very idea of democracy. This is what made the Pendergast machine so formidable. It was not a simple criminal gang, it was a parallel government, one that was often more responsive to the immediate needs of the people than the official one. It provided jobs, security, and social services, and in return, it demanded the surrender of democratic rights. For the thousands who benefited from its patronage, the trade off seemed more than fair. This deep integration into the daily life of the city, this perversion of the social contract, is what allowed Tom Pendergast to rule as an uncrowned king for so long. And it is why his shadow lingered over Kansas City long after his empire had turned to dust. The unraveling of Tom Pendergast's empire, while seemingly sudden, was the inevitable result of forces, both external and internal, converging upon a foundation that had been rotting from within for years. The machine, for all its terrifying efficiency, suffered from a fatal flaw. It was a personality cult built around one man, and its survival was entirely dependent on his infallibility. The first external shock was the election of Lloyd C. Stark as governor of Missouri in 1936. Pendergast, believing he had installed a loyal puppet in the state's highest office, made perhaps the greatest miscalculation of his career. Stark, however, was a man of ambition and independent means, and he recognized that destroying the Pendergast machine was not just good government, it was brilliant politics. He turned on his benefactor with a ferocity that stunned the political world. His first decisive move was to wrest control of the Kansas City Police Department from the city government, placing it under a state board that answered to him. This single act severed a critical artery of the machine. Overnight, the police were transformed from protectors of vice to its enemies. The gambling dens and brothels that had operated with impunity were suddenly raided and shuttered. The river of illicit cash that funded the machine's patronage network slowed to a trickle and then dried up completely. Without this money, the ward healers could no longer distribute Christmas baskets, pay rents, or provide jobs. The grateful loyalty of the populace began to waver as the machine's benefits vanished. Simultaneously, Stark empowered a relentless federal prosecutor, Maurice Milligan, to pursue the machine for voter fraud. Milligan secured 278 convictions for election fraud in Kansas City, systematically dismantling the machine's ability to steal elections and exposing its corrupt mechanics to public scorn. But the most devastating blow came from an entirely different direction: the quiet, methodical work of the Internal Revenue Service. While Stark attacked the machine's political power, IRS agent Rudolph Hartman began attacking Pendergast's personal fortune. The investigation was a masterpiece of financial detective work, tracing a complex web of secret accounts and clandestine cash transfers. They discovered the massive insurance kickback scheme, where Pendergast had received over $315, a colossal sum in the 1930s, for ensuring that certain companies received state contracts. This money was delivered in cash, stuffed into briefcases, and never reported as income. Pendergast's own ego and greed provided the final nail for his coffin. His extravagant lifestyle, his racehorses, and his massive gambling losses made him a visible target. He had failed to cover his tracks, believing himself to be untouchable. The federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, finally decided that Pendergast was a political liability and gave the prosecution its blessing. The man who had controlled every lever of power in Kansas City now found himself facing a power he could not manipulate: the federal justice system. The trial was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming. In May 1939, Tom Pendergast, the man who had appointed mayors and governors, stood convicted of income tax evasion. The mighty fortress had not been stormed by a rival army. It had collapsed because its king, blinded by hubris, had failed to see the cracks spreading across its walls until it was too late. The year 1939 marked the great and final humiliation. The public spectacle, where the myth of Pendergast's invincibility was shattered forever in the stark, unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. The trial of United States v. Thomas J. Pendergast was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national event, a morality play that captivated a country weary from the Depression and hungry for tales of comeuppance. The setting itself was a powerful symbol. Pendergast, who had for 2 decades held court in the smoky back rooms of the Doghouse, now sat in the sterile, public arena of the courthouse, subject to rules he did not write and a judge he did not appoint. The prosecution, led by the dogged U.S. Attorney Maurice Milligan, did not need to parade a procession of gangsters or victims before the jury. Their case was built on a mountain of paper, a dry but devastating avalanche of financial records that was far more damning than any eyewitness testimony could ever be. They presented bank ledgers, canceled checks, and tax returns that painted an irrefutable picture of systematic fraud. The centerpiece was the insurance pool, bribe, a $315,000 payment that had been funneled to Pendergast in exchange for his influence in securing lucrative contracts from the state of Missouri. The money, often transported in cash-filled suitcases, had vanished into a labyrinth of secret accounts and left no trace on his tax returns. The defense's argument that Pendergast was a simple man bewildered by complex finances and that the money was merely loans from friends, rang hollow in the face of such meticulous evidence. The sheer scale of the hidden wealth, the deliberate secrecy of the transactions, and the testimony from insurance executives who detailed the payoffs all pointed to a conscious, calculated effort to defraud the government. Pendergast, the master strategist, was outmaneuvered on a battlefield of facts and figures. His quiet authority, which had once cowered opponents in City Hall, held no power in this room. He was just another defendant, his fate resting in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. The verdict, when it came, was a thunderclap that echoed across the nation. Guilty. The man who had controlled the destiny of a major American city for a generation was now a convicted fill-on. The sentencing that followed was a ritual of public shaming. Judge Merrill E. Otis, in a voice dripping with contempt, condemned Pendergast's crimes as a shocking betrayal of public trust that had poisoned the very wells of democracy. He then handed down the maximum sentence, allowed by law, 15 months in a federal penitentiary and a 110,000 fine. But the prison term was almost incidental. The true punishment was the complete and utter destruction of his legacy. Within days, the Missouri Bar Association disbarred him, stripping him of his professional identity. The political machine, that intricate and powerful organism, began to disintegrate the moment its head was severed. Without Pendergast's central command and his flow of illicit cash, the network of ward healers, corrupt officials, and loyalists scattered to the winds. The fortress, which had seemed so impregnable, had collapsed from within, its foundations rotted by the very corruption that had once made it strong. The king was now a prisoner, first in Leavenworth and then, due to his failing health, at the medical center in Springfield. His reign was over. His name was mud, and his empire was revealed to have been a house of cards, toppled not by a rival, but by the relentless, boring, and ultimately unstoppable force of the law. The final years of Tom Pendergast's life, from his release from prison in 1941 to his death in 1945, represent a profound and somber epilogue to a saga of immense power and catastrophic fall. He returned to Kansas City, but it was a city that had fundamentally changed, a body that had expelled a virus and was slowly, painfully, learning to heal. The machine was a ghost. The men who once waited for hours in the doghouse for a moment of his time now averted their gaze when he passed. The phone in his mansion on Ward Parkway, which had once been a hotline to the corridors of power, was now largely silent. He was a pariah, a living monument to his own disgrace. His health, always precarious, continued its steep decline. The heart condition that had secured his early release was now a constant companion, a physical manifestation of a broken spirit and a shattered will. He became a recluse, a spectral figure trapped in the gilded cage of his past, wandering the halls of a home that must have felt more like a museum of his own failure. The world outside was moving on at a dizzying pace. America was now fully immersed in World War II and the monumental life and death struggles on battlefields across the globe made the local political corruption of the 1930s seem like a small, sordid, and distant memory. The era of the grandiose political boss was passing into history, replaced by a more modern, media-conscious, and bureaucratic form of governance. Pendergast was an anachronism in his own lifetime, a relic from a darker age. The most poignant and ironic twist in this final chapter was the simultaneous ascent of his most famous protégé, Harry S. Truman. As Pendergast faded into obscurity and ill health, Truman was rocketing to the zenith of American power. In 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt selected Truman as his vice presidential running mate, a decision that horrified many national Democrats who saw Truman as tainted by his association with the Pendergast machine. Yet, Truman's own reputation for personal honesty and his effective work as a senator allowed him to survive the association. He never publicly denounced the man who gave him his start, a testament to Truman's stubborn, often frustrating, personal loyalty, but neither did he lift a finger to help his former patron after the fall. The relationship was severed, a necessary amputation for Truman's political survival. Then, in April of 1945, the unimaginable happened. President Roosevelt died, and Harry S. Truman, the man whose political career was launched from a desk in Tom Pendergast's Doghouse, was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. One can only imagine the torrent of complex, bitter, and regretful thoughts that must have flooded the mind of the dying boss. To see the ultimate prize of American political power handed to his one-time ally, while he himself was a disgraced and forgotten felon, must have been the final, cruelest blow. The wheel of fortune had turned completely, leaving him crushed at the bottom. On January 26, 1945, just a few months before Truman would order the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, Thomas Joseph Pendergast died at his home. The official cause was a coronary occlusion, but it was truly a death from a broken heart and a vanquished empire. His funeral was a muted, sparsely attended affair, a stark contrast to the pomp and power that would have accompanied his passing a decade earlier. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery, his legacy not one of honor or achievement, but a permanent and complex stain on the history of his city, a cautionary tale of the intoxicating nature of power and the inescapable gravity of its consequences. The legacy of Tom Pendergast is a deep and permanent scar on the civic body of Kansas City, a complex wound that took generations to heal and whose faint outline can still be perceived in the city's character and political DNA. To assess his impact is to grapple with a profound and troubling duality. On one hand, his machine provided a brutal, authoritarian form of stability during the most economically desperate period in American history, while the rest of the country was paralyzed by the Great Depression. Kansas City, fueled by Pendergast's illicit cash and his control over New Deal funds, was a hive of activity. Men had jobs, families were fed, and the city's infrastructure modernized at a remarkable pace. There was a perverse kind of social contract in place. The people surrendered their democratic rights, and in return, the machine provided a safety net and a semblance of economic security. This has led to a strange, lingering nostalgia in some quarters, a distorted memory of a time when things got done without the messiness of democratic debate. But this view is a dangerous illusion, for it ignores the terrifying cost of that efficiency. The most damaging legacy was the systemic corruption of the city's institutions and the collective psyche of its citizens. For nearly 2 decades, an entire generation was taught that the law was malleable, that justice was for sale, and that success was achieved not through hard work and integrity, but through connections and payoffs. This bred a deep-seated cynicism and a distrust of government that became embedded in the culture. The police force was not seen as protectors, but as enforcers for a corrupt regime. The courts were not halls of justice, but marketplaces for favors. This erosion of public trust was perhaps the most difficult damage to repair, requiring a complete overhaul of the police department and a decades-long effort to restore faith in local government. Furthermore, the machine's cozy alliance with organized crime left a criminal element deeply entrenched in the city's economy, a problem that persisted long after Pendergast was gone. The open city policy had invited in national syndicates, and rooting them out proved to be a Herculean task. The city's national reputation was also tarnished. For years, Kansas City was known not for its jazz or its stockyards, but as Pendergast's town, a byword for corruption and misrule. This not only hurt civic pride, but also deterred legitimate business investment. The Pendergast era also left a complicated racial legacy. While the machine was hardly a progressive force, it did, in its transactional way, integrate African American voters into its system. The wards in black neighborhoods received the same patronage: jobs, food baskets, help with the law in exchange for their votes. This provided a certain level of political inclusion that was rare in many other American cities at the time, and it allowed the vibrant black cultural scene in the 18th and Vine district to flourish under the machine's protection. However, this was not empowerment. It was another form of dependency, a system that provided basic sustenance in exchange for political subservience, ultimately delaying the fight for genuine civil rights and self-determination. The fall of Pendergast was therefore not just the downfall of a man, it was a necessary, painful catharsis for the entire city. It was a demonstration that the rule of law, though slow and imperfect, could ultimately prevail. The reforms that followed, however difficult, were a recommitment to the principles of democracy. The story of Tom Pendergast thus stands as an eternal, dark mirror for any society, a warning of the seductive danger of trading liberty for order, and of the corrosive power of absolute control, which ultimately destroys not only its victims, but also its wielder. To fully comprehend the Pendergast machine, one must look beyond the man and examine the intricate and ruthless system he engineered, a political instrument of near perfect control that was both admired and feared for its chilling efficiency. The machine was not a disorganized mob. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered corporation of corruption, with a clear hierarchy, specialized departments, and a robust revenue stream. At its base were the precinct captains and ward healers, the ground-level operatives who were the machine's face in every neighborhood. These men were social workers, fixers, and enforcers all rolled into one. They knew which families needed a Thanksgiving turkey, which young men needed a city job to support a new family, and which businessmen were behind on their contributions. They maintained detailed ledgers of favors given and owed, creating a web of obligation that was impossible to escape. This information flowed upward to district leaders, who coordinated the efforts of dozens of precincts, ensuring that every block was accounted for and that every potential vote was harvested. At the very top sat Pendergast himself in his Spartan office at 1908 Main Street, the central processing unit of this vast human network. Here, he would receive a constant stream of supplicants, listening in silence to their requests for contracts, jobs, or clemency, his decisions acting as the final, unappealable law. The financial engine that powered this political behemoth was its partnership with organized crime. Kansas City's status as an open city was not an accident, it was official policy, a carefully negotiated agreement between the machine and criminal syndicates from across the country. Every brothel, every gambling den, every illegal liquor operation paid a standardized fee for protection. This was not a random shakedown. It was a bureaucratized tax system run with a cold, business-like precision. The funds were collected regularly and flowed upward, where they were used to finance the massive patronage system that bought the loyalty of the electorate. This created a self-sustaining cycle. Vice money bought votes, and political power protected vice. On election day, this apparatus transformed into a weapon of democratic destruction. The machine employed floaters, men who would be paid to vote multiple times in different precincts. They used tissue ballots, pre-marked ballots that a voter would place over a blank one, transferring the impression to the legitimate ballot. Poll watchers from opposition parties were intimidated, assaulted, or barred from entering. Ballot boxes were stuffed in back rooms long before the polls closed. The results were not counted, they were manufactured. The machine could confidently predict victory, margins down to the decimal point, because they were the ones who wrote the totals. This system was so effective and so brazen that it produced voter turnout figures that were mathematically impossible, a blatant mockery of the democratic process. Yet, for the average citizen who benefited from a city job or a holiday food basket, the machine was a benevolent, if authoritarian, force. It provided a form of stability and security during the chaotic years of the Depression. This is what made it so resilient and so difficult to dismantle. It wasn't just fear that kept it in power, it was a perverted form of gratitude. The Pendergast machine was a dark mirror of a functional government, a stark demonstration that if a state fails to provide for its people, a criminal enterprise will step in to fill the void, demanding a price far greater than any tax, the very soul of democracy itself. The story of Tom Pendergast is inextricably linked to one of the most enduring questions in American political history. What was the true nature of his relationship with Harry S. Truman? And how did this association shape the destiny of the nation? This relationship was a complex tapestry of mutual benefit, personal loyalty, and profound political risk. When Pendergast first backed Truman for county judge in 1925, many within the machine were skeptical. Truman was an outsider, a failed haberdasher, a World War I veteran, and, most alarmingly, he had a reputation for stubborn honesty. He was not a typical machine hack. But Pendergast, in a display of his sharp political instinct, saw something others did not. He recognized that Truman's very honesty made him electable, and that his sense of loyalty, once given, was unshakable. For Truman, the alliance was a pragmatic necessity. In the rough and tumble world of Jackson County politics, having the support of the Pendergast machine was the only path to electoral victory. It was a devil's bargain, but one Truman believed he could navigate without soiling his own integrity. And for the most part, he did. As county judge, Truman earned a reputation for efficiency and honesty, building roads and managing county affairs with a scrupulous attention to detail that surprised even his critics. He delivered competent administration, and in return, Pendergast delivered the votes. This symbiotic relationship continued when Pendergast supported Truman for the U.S. Senate in 1934. Truman's opponent in the Democratic primary famously derided him as the Pendergast candidate, a label that would haunt him for his entire career. But once in the Senate, Truman worked diligently to prove himself, most notably through his leadership of the Truman Committee, which investigated waste and fraud in wartime military spending, saving American taxpayers billions of dollars. He carefully maintained his distance from the machine's more sordid activities, focusing on his work in Washington. When Pendergast's empire began to crumble, Truman faced his greatest test. His enemies, both Republican and Democratic, saw their chance to destroy him by tying him to the boss's crimes. They demanded he denounce Pendergast, but Truman, true to his character, refused. He made a careful distinction, stating that while he was the Pendergast candidate, he was not the Pendergast office holder. He never repudiated the man who gave him his start, a stance that some saw as honorable and others as politically foolish. This stubborn loyalty nearly cost him the vice presidential nomination in 1944. Party bosses were deeply wary of his association with the convicted felon. Yet, Truman's sterling record and reputation as an honest man ultimately prevailed. The greatest irony in American political history then unfolded. The man whose career was launched from the heart of a corrupt machine became the president known for his blunt honesty and integrity, coining the phrase, "The buck stops here." As president, Truman's administration was notably free of the scandal that would later plague other presidencies. In a strange way, Truman's ultimate success was the final and most powerful repudiation of Pendergastism. It demonstrated that an honest man could emerge from a corrupt system, not by embracing its values, but by holding fast to his own. The relationship between the boss and the president remains a subject of intense historical debate, a story of how ambition and integrity, corruption and duty can become strangely and permanently intertwined on the long and winding road to power. The cultural and social landscape of Kansas City under Tom Pendergast's rule was a study in stark contrasts, a city living a double life where world, class artistry flourished in the shadow of rampant criminality. This was the era that gave birth to the Kansas City jazz sound, a vibrant, swinging style that would influence the course of American music. Legends like Charlie Parker, Count Basie, and Big Joe Turner found their voices in the packed clubs that lined 18th and Vine and 12th Street. These establishments, many of which were owned or protected by the machine, operated with a freedom unimaginable in other, more morally rigid American cities. The music played all night, every night in a city that never slept, because the official curfew was never enforced. The air was thick with the sound of saxophones and the smell of barbecue and bootleg whiskey. This cultural renaissance was directly funded by the illicit profits of the Pendergast machine. The gambling dens and speakeasies provided the venues and the paying gigs for musicians. The mobsters who ran these clubs were often the patrons who paid the musicians a decent wage, allowing them to hone their craft. The police on the Pendergast payroll ensured there were no disruptive raids, no moral crusades to shut down the sin. For the artists, it was a golden age of creative ferment, a bubble of artistic freedom inflated by corruption. Yet, this vibrant scene was the glittering facade of a deeply sick city. While the jazz was swinging in the downtown clubs, the political opposition was being systematically silenced through intimidation and violence. Reform-minded journalists faced threats and saw their newspapers' advertising revenue mysteriously dry up as businesses were warned not to support them. Union organizers who challenged the machine's control over labor were beaten in alleyways. The city's government was a hollow shell, its departments staffed not by competent administrators, but by political hacks whose only qualification was their loyalty to the boss. The public school system, the public health department, every civic institution was subverted to serve the machine's ends. The city's infrastructure, while expanding, was being built with inferior Pendergast concrete, a physical metaphor for the shoddy foundation upon which his entire empire was constructed. For the average citizen not frequenting the jazz clubs, life was a matter of navigating this dual reality. You could enjoy the unparalleled nightlife, you could benefit from a machine job, but you also lived with the constant, low-grade fear of crossing an invisible line. You knew that the police were not your friends, that the courts would not provide justice, and that your vote was meaningless. This created a society of complicit silence, where the majority looked the other way because the machine, for all its evils, provided a certain chaotic order and economic sustenance during the worst economic crisis the nation had ever seen. The Pendergast era in Kansas City stands as a powerful reminder that great art can emerge from the most corrupt and oppressive environments, but that this artistic flourishing often comes at an immense, hidden cost to the civic soul. It was a devil's bargain, where the price for a legendary soundtrack was the very foundation of a just and democratic society. The national implications of Tom Pendergast's machine extended far beyond the borders of Missouri, serving as a stark warning and a political football in the high-stakes game of American power politics. For the National Democratic Party, Pendergast was both a valuable asset and a dangerous liability. His ability to deliver the entire state of Missouri, a crucial swing state, in national elections made him a kingmaker whom President Franklin D. Roosevelt and other party leaders felt compelled to court. The massive federal spending of the New Deal, channeled through Pendergast's control, cemented this alliance. The Works Progress Administration funds that built Kansas City's infrastructure also built Pendergast's power, creating a direct financial pipeline from the U.S. Treasury to the machine's coffers. This relationship demonstrated the dark underbelly of the New Deal, where the urgent need for economic recovery sometimes forced pragmatic alliances with corrupt local bosses who could get projects moving quickly. However, as Pendergast's corruption became too brazen to ignore, he transformed from a strategic partner into a millstone around the neck of the National Party. Republicans used Pendergastism as a powerful slur, a shorthand for the cronyism and corruption they alleged was endemic to the entire Democratic administration. They painted Roosevelt as being in bed with gangsters, using Pendergast as their prime example. This mounting political pressure is what ultimately led Roosevelt to greenlight the federal investigations that would bring the boss down. The president could no longer afford the association. The fall of Pendergast thus sent a shockwave through American politics. It signaled a shift in how the federal government would deal with localized corruption, establishing a precedent for using federal agencies like the IRS to attack problems that local authorities were too cowed or too complicit to address. It demonstrated that even the most powerful local boss was vulnerable to the concentrated power of the federal justice system. Furthermore, the Pendergast saga heavily influenced the political career of Harry S. Truman, with consequences that would reshape the post-war world. Throughout Truman's rise to the vice presidency and then the presidency, his opponents constantly invoked the ghost of Pendergast to question his integrity and independence. This relentless scrutiny forced Truman to be scrupulously honest in his own administration, leading to a presidency remarkably free of financial scandal. The Pendergast taint also shaped Truman's famous, almost militant, loyalty to his subordinates, having been unfairly tarred by association himself. He was fiercely defensive of his own appointees when they came under attack. On a broader scale, the story of Pendergast became a national allegory for the dangers of machine politics and the corrupting influence of absolute power. It was studied by political scientists, cited by reformers, and served as a cautionary tale for other cities grappling with their own political machines. The narrative of a single, unelected man controlling an entire American city captured the public imagination and reinforced a deep-seated American fear of centralized, unaccountable power. The rise and fall of Tom Pendergast was not just a local story. It was a national drama that exposed the fragile line between political organization and criminal enterprise. And it forever changed the relationship between local political machines and the expanding power of the federal government in Washington. The psychological portrait of Tom Pendergast reveals a man of profound contradictions, a character whose internal complexities defy the simple label of a crime boss or corrupt politician. He was not a flamboyant, Al Capone style figure who reveled in his notoriety. Rather, he was a quiet, almost ascetic man who wielded power with a chilling stillness. Publicly, he cultivated an image of the respectable civic leader, a devoted family man, a pillar of his Catholic Church, a philanthropist who gave generously to hospitals and charities. This veneer of bourgeois normality was his most effective disguise, allowing the city's business and social elite to rationalize their dealings with him. They could convince themselves they were engaging with a tough but legitimate political leader, not a criminal mastermind. Inside his headquarters, the infamous Doghouse, he held a daily court that was a study in quiet intimidation. He would sit for hours, a large, imposing figure behind his desk, listening impassively to an endless parade of supplicants. Mayors seeking guidance, businessmen seeking contracts, desperate mothers seeking a son's release from jail. He spoke little, his silence itself a tool of power, forcing others to fill the void with their own fears and compromises. His decisions, when they came, were final and delivered with an air of infallible judgment. This created an aura of omniscience, making him seem less like a man and more like an inevitable force of nature. Yet, beneath this controlled exterior lay a turbulent inner world dominated by two powerful and ultimately self-destructive forces: an insatiable lust for absolute control and a compulsive gambling addiction. The first drove him to build an empire of unmatched scope, a system where his will was the ultimate law. The second, his addiction to horse racing, was the crack in his armor, the personal demon he could not conquer. He maintained a stable of racehorses and would wager staggering sums, losses that required a constant, massive inflow of cash. This is the central tragedy of Pendergast. The man who exhibited superhuman discipline in constructing his political machine was utterly enslaved by a personal vice. The same strategic mind that could outmaneuver governors and senators was helpless against the lure of the racetrack. This addiction directly fueled the brazen corruption that toppled him. The massive insurance bribe was as much about feeding his gambling habit as it was about enriching his empire. His story is a classic tale of hubris, but it is also a deeply human one. He was a man who understood the mechanics of power intimately, but failed to understand its limits, who could command the loyalty of thousands, but could not command himself. In his final years, a broken man living in the opulent prison of his own mansion, he must have been haunted by the echoes of his own choices. The same city that had pulsed to his rhythm now moved on without him. The phone was silent, the visitors were gone, and the power that had defined his very existence had evaporated. He died as he had lived, a complex and contradictory figure, a man who built a city and corrupted its soul, a tyrant who provided for the poor, a criminal who demanded loyalty and gave it in return, a king who died a prisoner, his legacy a permanent and troubling scar on the American urban landscape. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey through the shadows of American power, that began with a single, shocking premise: that one man could rule a great city, not from a throne, but from a nondescript office he called the Doghouse. The story of Tom Pendergast is more than a historical curiosity. It is a permanent and sobering lesson in the fragility of democracy and the seductive, corrosive nature of absolute power. We have walked through the rise, from the gritty saloon politics of his brother, James, to the meticulously constructed empire that controlled every job, every contract, every vote, and every crime in Kansas City. We have witnessed the zenith of his power, a time when the city thrived in a perverse way, its streets paved with his concrete, its nightlife buzzing with jazz funded by his illicit deals, its people caught in a web of gratitude and fear. We saw the intricate machinery of his machine, a chillingly efficient system that mirrored a government, providing welfare and security in exchange for the surrender of basic democratic rights. We observed the fatal flaws, the hubris that made him believe he was above the law, the gambling addiction that demanded an endless river of cash, and the miscalculation that a puppet governor would remain a puppet. We endured with the city the painful, public unraveling, the federal investigations, the damning evidence of tax evasion, the stunning courtroom verdict, and the humiliating fall from king to convict. We reflected on the complex legacy, the damaged civic trust, the entrenched criminality, and the strange, bittersweet nostalgia for a time when things, however corruptly, got done, and we pondered the great national implications. How this boss from the heartland influenced presidential politics and became a symbol of everything to fear in centralized, unaccountable power. The ghost of Tom Pendergast asks us uncomfortable questions that echo into our own time. How does corruption take root? It begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, with a small favor, a minor compromise, a seemingly harmless bending of the rules. It flourishes in the space between the law and the needs of the people, when official institutions fail to provide justice or opportunity. It sells itself as efficiency, as a way to cut through red tape and get results. The story of Pendergast is a warning to always be vigilant, to cherish and protect the messy, frustrating, but essential processes of democracy, for they are the only true bulwark against the silent takeover by those who would trade liberty for control. It is a reminder that no one is truly above the law, that however imposing a fortress may seem, it can be brought down by the relentless pursuit of justice. The saga of the Kansas City crime boss is finally over, but the lessons it imparts are timeless. Thank you for listening to this comprehensive account. If you found this deep dive into history compelling, if you believe in the importance of remembering these stories to safeguard our future, then please do not let the conversation end here. Show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more meticulously researched content, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What other figures or events from history would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps ensure that these crucial stories continue to be told. Thank you for your time, and until next time, stay curious.